Chapter 9, Alcohol. This is the full video of my lecture for the Substance Use Disorder Counseling and Chemical Dependency classes. In this chapter, we will examine alcohol use disorder and its overlap with drug addiction. Because alcohol is so commonly used in our society, many people take it for granted. This video provides a lot of basic information about alcohol and some of the problems with its use. You can also find much more extensive information on alcohol on the Learning About Alcohol playlist. This video, Chapter 9, Alcohol, is by David Joel Miller. Some of the material originally was presented on the counselorsoapbox.com blog. The photos are all courtesy of Pixabay and Wikimedia Common and are available in the public domain. There are many kinds of alcohol, but only one is drinkable. Isopropyl alcohol, rubbing alcohol, methyl alcohol, sometimes called wood alcohol, are both produced for industrial and other uses, but the beverage alcohol is ethanol or ethyl alcohol. This drug, and it is a drug, has been used the longest of any of the known drugs and is probably the most commonly used drug in most of the countries on Earth. Drinkers spend a lot of time discussing the various types of alcoholic beverages. All of them contain ethanol. The types are beer, wine, malt liquor, and what we call hard liquors, which are distilled spirits. These could include gin, vodka, whiskey, rum, and so on. There are also many cocktails or mixtures of various alcoholic beverages and various mixing fluids. How is alcohol produced? It's produced by the process of fermentation, in which yeast converts sugar into alcohol. The maximum normal level of alcohol in a beverage is between 12 and 15%. Above that, the alcohol actually begins to inactivate the yeast. Stronger beverages can be made by a process called fortification, in which pure alcohol is added to the wine or other beverage. The other way in which alcoholic beverages are made stronger is distillation. In this process, they cook the beer, wine, or other beverage and then cool the steam. Alcohol has a lower evaporation point, boiling point, and so the first batch that's cooked off is a higher alcohol concentration. And repeated distillations can increase the percentage of alcohol in the beverage. We use two different scales to measure how much alcohol is in an alcoholic beverage: proof or percentage. Fermentation creates the alcohol. Beer and wine are measured by percentage, and the maximum natural percentage is about 15%. Liquor is produced by distillation and therefore can run much higher. 100% alcohol would be a 200 proof alcoholic beverage. The typical beverage is 86 proof, which is the equivalent of 43% alcohol. You can see it's easy to take a percentage, multiply by 2 and get the proof number, or to take the proof number and divide by 2 and get the percentage. Here's a slide on converting percentage to proof. 100% equals 200 proof, 86 proof is 43%. It's interesting to note that it's not possible to make pure 100% alcohol. Alcohol so strongly attracts water that just pure alcohol is not possible. If you were to fill a glass completely full of pure alcohol and step back, within a few moments it would begin to overflow as the alcohol sucked moisture out of the air. Even in very dry areas it will do this. This is also part of the reason for hangovers and the effects of alcohol, because it sucks water, moisture out of the system as it goes through the human body. Under natural conditions, the strongest that it's possible to make alcoholic beverages here on planet Earth is 191 proof, which is 95.5% alcohol. That's not legal in all places. Here in California, the strongest beverage available is 151, which is slightly above 75% alcohol. When did humans first begin to consume alcohol? Different authors and different textbooks use different dates, but there's good evidence of accidental fermentation occurring during the Old Stone Age. Even when Europe was covered in ice, there were places at low altitudes where the ice didn't cover the ground, and as it melted from the glaciers, that ran down in streams and to rivers. Along that bare ground, bushes would grow and berries would be produced. There's evidence the people who lived in caves collected those berries, took them back into the caves, and hollowed out holding facilities, bowls in the stone, and stored them. Those berries then would ferment and produce a fermented beverage. Whether that was intentional or accidental, we can't be sure. But by as recently as 6,000 years before our current era, almost 8,000 years ago, there were formal recipes for beer being produced in Egypt, and in fact, temples devoted to the production of beer. The distillation of alcoholic beverages appears to have begun in China about 1,000 years before the current era. Western Europe did not get the process of distillation until about 800 AD, when crusaders and tourists from the Arab countries brought it back to Western Europe. It's also noteworthy to me that Western Europe had a process for fermenting honey and making mead, which was a more common beverage than beers or wines in Western Europe and the Great Britain. The question often comes up, is alcohol use good or bad? Early uses of alcohol included things like births, marriages, funerals, and religious ceremonies. Abuse, however, included things like drunkenness and problem behaviors and was condemned as an evil. Even as far back as the Old Testament, there are comments about using alcohol religiously, but also about not being a drunkard. Alcohol use was introduced into the New World, and it arose from two different sources. One is that the Pilgrims ran out of grog and landed at Plymouth Rock. Originally, the reports are that they intended to go farther south, but no more grog in the hull of the ship, and they had to stop and find something to ferment. Grog then included both beer and rum. It was also in use, alcohol, by native populations in Mexico who used the fruit of one of the cactus plants to produce pulque, and we estimate that that began to be used about 200 AD or 200 current era. Between 1790, right after the U.S. Revolution, and up to about 1830, just before the Civil War, throughout the formative part of the United States, Americans were very heavy drinkers, averaging about 5 standard drinks per day. Later we'll have to define what a standard drink was, but it's noteworthy that early colonial times Americans were very heavy drinkers. Very early, people began to question drinking and the problems it created. As early as 1785, Dr. Benjamin Rush, the first Surgeon General of the United States, in one of his books on the problems with alcoholism, and began to define alcoholism as a disease. This was followed by a thing called the temperance movement. Now, originally, temperance movement did not want prohibition, but what they wanted to do was encourage people to drink less, drink in moderation, drink in safe places. As the westward expansion occurred, drinking in saloons became a common part of the Wild West. And as we see in other chapters, that whiskey served in many of those saloons was laudanum, which was whiskey which also contained some powdered morphine sulfate dissolved in it. That heavy drinking and drugging culture often included violence. And so the temperance movement becomes the anti-saloon league, where while they didn't oppose drinking completely, they opposed places where people, men principally, would go to drink and get drunk, and there was ensuing violence. Next came the march towards prohibition. The temperance movement became the abstinence movement, which was an attempt to get people to be teetotalers and not drink at all. World War II came along, and there was a temporary lull in this activity. Following World War II, we had prohibition, and we talked about that in the chapter on the history of drug use. Prohibition was a prohibition on the commercial sale and manufacture, but not on the home use or drinking if you had it. When prohibition was repealed, the result was a patchwork of laws and taxes. Some places were dry, some were moist, where it could only be sold in certain percentages and in certain days, and some were completely open. The new policy after prohibition was drink all you can, just don't get drunk, an inconsistency that continues to plague us to this day. Since the end of prohibition, we've seen a shift in the U.S. alcoholic consumption, although this changes slowly over time. Since prohibition, consumption has fluctuated between 2 and 2.5 gallons of pure alcohol per person per year. This amounts to an average of 1.5 to 2 beers per day per person over the age 14. However, we should note here that 50% of the U.S. population who is an adult able to drink has not had a drink in the last 30 days. This means that there are a small number of heavy drinkers who radically increase the average consumption. A 12-ounce beer is about 0.45 ounces of alcohol, and the type of beverage that has been consumed has fluctuated over time. Average consumption definitely hides the problem of the heavy drinker. About 10% of men binge drink, that is 5 drinks on one occasion, over once per week, roughly 5 times per month. In other words, 10% of men, when they drink to intoxication and beyond. Drinking in the elderly. As people age, their tolerance declines. 1 drink a day may be acceptable for non-pregnant adults in their younger years, but one source I have says 3 or more beverages per week for an 80-year-old would be binge drinking and may impair their health. The elderly also take more prescribed medication, which may interact with their alcohol. And the elderly percentage of the population is growing rapidly. This group of seniors, the baby boomer generation, the old hippies, many of them are still abusing street drugs. While in past generations, as people age, they gave up drugs and alcohol, this generation has continued to do their drugs all the way into senior centers and nursing homes. Drinking on college campuses has been and continues to be a problem. It is often a tradition, and the percentage of binge drinkers has been relatively constant, while the percentage of abstainers has been growing. This means that the heavier drinkers are more concentrated. The heaviest drinking occurs among first-year students who often get so into partying that they can't complete their first year and drop out. It's higher among white Caucasian students. Fraternities and sorority members are more likely to be heavy drinkers, and athletes are. A white fraternity athlete who's in their freshman year is almost doomed. A little bit about the pharmacology of alcohol. It depresses the central nervous system. It is readily transported in the blood because it mixes so readily with water. It affects cell membranes. It affects all neurotransmitter and neurochemical systems. It affects all endocrine systems. And no cell in the body is more than 4 cells away from a primary blood source. And every cell is nourished by blood. Therefore, when alcohol enters the mouth and gets into the bloodstream, it will touch every cell in the body. The pharmacokinetics, or movement, of alcohol. Most is absorbed in the small intestine. It can be vaporized and then absorbed in the lungs. Factors which influence absorption is passage from the stomach to the intestine. There's a little valve, a pyloric valve at the end of the stomach, and if the stomach is irritated, that closes and results in vomiting and throwing up the irritating food. Food present in the stomach can also slow the passage. Faster drinking, however, results in faster absorption. High concentration beverages are absorbed faster. They're higher proof. Carbonated drinks also are absorbed in the intestine much more rapidly. Time really matters when it comes to drinking. Once you stop drinking, the blood alcohol content continues to rise for 30 to 90 minutes. This results in a lot of people getting DUIs. They're drinking, they feel a little woozy, so they stop. They wait an hour before they attempt to drive, thinking that after an hour, the alcohol level in their bloodstream will have gone down. Unfortunately, over that hour to 90 minutes after they stop drinking, whatever was in the stomach continues to go into the intestine, be absorbed in the bloodstream, and their level continues to rise. I mentioned before the pyloric valve, that when it's irritated by alcohol, this closes, stops the absorption, and may result in rejection of stomach contents. I think most heavy drinkers have gone through a period in which they spent time worshiping the porcelain god pictured to the right. Alcohol distribution. Once absorbed, the blood distributes alcohol to all the body's tissues. Blood is 70% water and reaches a high concentration of alcohol very quickly. It affects primarily the central nervous system, especially the brain. There is an LD50, LD meaning lethal dose, 50%. That is the lethal dose that will kill 50% of humans who are able to consume it without throwing up, is about 50 standard drinks in an hour or less. However, the liver can only remove 1 drink an hour, so 51 drinks in 2 hours, more doable. 52 drinks spread out over 3 hours, more durable. So people who reach a lethal level frequently have been drinking heavily over multiple hours. What is a standard drink? A standard drink is a way of comparing the alcohol content of various beverages. A standard drink contains 1/2 ounce of pure alcohol. That would amount to 12 ounces of a 4% beer. Some people think they're getting a lot less alcohol by drinking light beer, but light beer is maybe 10% less alcohol, but largely fewer calories. So by drinking light beer, rather than avoiding intoxication, you just become a slim, fit drunk. 4 ounces of wine, 12%. Some textbooks say 5 ounces, depending on whether the wine is 12 or 15% content. 1 ounce of 90 to 100 proof. The standard is 86 proof. However, drinkers need to be careful. The standard shot glass contains a lot more than 1 ounce, and most people don't stop at the 1 ounce point in the shot glass, so it's easy to get considerably more than you think. A standard drink raises most people's blood alcohol content between 0.02 and 0.03. So some people are hit harder by the alcohol they consume. Legal limit is important to consider. When I first started driving in the last millennium, the legal limit was 0.10. Since then, it's been reduced in the United States to 0.08, except in the state of Utah. Utah has now gone to 0.05, which is 2 to 2.5 drinks. In Norway, it is 0.05. In Finland and Sweden, the legal limit is 0.02. You finish that first beer and you can't drive. Mentioned that there is an LD50, lethal dose. Various authorities put that amount of alcohol as between 0.45 and 0.50 blood alcohol content is enough to kill half the people that reach that level. Not everyone gets the same blood alcohol content number or blood alcohol level. Lighter people have less water in the body and therefore get a higher blood alcohol content. Women, in their ability to produce breast milk, have more fat cells and less water in their bodies, and therefore women who consume the same amount of alcohol as a man of exactly the same weight still get a higher blood alcohol content. And older people, because their livers may be compromised, not functioning as well, and so not removing it as quickly, also get a much higher blood alcohol content. The acute effects of alcohol depend on the level, and while this chart tells us what should be happening, we find that some people who drink on a regular basis develop tolerance. They think they are much less intoxicated than they actually are. At between 0.01 and 0.02, less than one standard drink, slight change of feelings. Between 0.03 and 0.04, they're relaxed, but there's some mild motor impairment. Between 0.05 and 0.06, they begin to be impaired. There's a thing called a wet reckless. If you make a turn without signaling, go through a stop sign, etc., even though it's not technically a DUI, you can be arrested if you have alcohol in the 0.05 to 0.06 range in many jurisdictions and violate another law. 0.08 to 0.09 is where we begin to see people impaired. They're obviously impaired, and at that point it's a driving under the influence or driving while intoxicated. At 0.10, we see slurred speech and staggering. 0.15, major impairment, reflexes, coordination, complex tasks. 0.20, drowsiness, double vision. By 0.30, most people experience stupor and passing out. I remember seeing one person in the psychiatric hospital, sent from a medical hospital because they were saying they were suicidal, whose blood alcohol content was 0.32. This person drank to this level on a regular daily basis and was able to have a pretty good conversation at that 0.32 level. They should have been in stupor or passing out, but the next morning they didn't have much of a recollection of what had happened. By 0.40, most people are unconscious, and by 0.45 to 0.50, half of the people who reach this level are dead. If you ever have a client arrive who is above 0.50, it's probably a waste of time to talk to them, because unless they are emergency hospital attention, they will be dead within a few minutes. Metabolism and excretion. 90% of the alcohol is metabolized in the body, mostly in the liver. A small amount is metabolized in the stomach of men, and this is another reason why women get a higher blood alcohol content than men do. Women's stomachs don't produce the enzyme to break down alcohol the way men's do. The rest is excreted unmetabolized by the kidney and lungs, although that's a relatively small amount. But the rate at which it's excreted through the lungs is uniform, and this is the basis for breathalyzers. The body metabolizes about 0.35 ounces an hour, but the standard drink is between 0.45 and 0.50. So for most people, 1 drink an hour, gradually their blood alcohol level will continue to climb. It's important for people who work in the drug and alcohol counseling field to understand the breakdown process for alcohol. In the videos in the class on alcoholism study, we go into this in even more detail, but here's the simple part of it. First, alcohol that we're talking about is ethanol. It is broken down by an enzyme, alcohol dehydrogenase. This produces a breakdown product called acetaldehyde. Acetaldehyde is more toxic and harder to break down than alcohol. Acetaldehyde is largely responsible for the hangover feelings. Acetaldehyde is then broken down by a second enzyme into carbon dioxide and water. Carbon dioxide comes out in the breath from the lungs, assuming you have good lung function, and the water in urine. It's possible to take a medication, disulfiram, the brand name Antabuse, which will stop this breakdown process. That results in high levels of acetaldehyde and nausea and vomiting. Unfortunately, most alcoholics won't take it, and if they do, they drink anyway and then get violently ill and throw up until they finally get all of that Antabuse or disulfiram out of their system. So using medication to prevent drinking has not proved particularly useful for most alcoholics. Tolerance is an important part of understanding drug and alcohol use, abuse, and recovery. Over time, a person may need to drink larger quantities of alcohol to achieve the same mood change. Or, if they drink the same amount, it has less and less of an effect on them. There's also a thing called cross-tolerance. Tolerance to alcohol from repeated drinking increases tolerance to other drugs, even if you have never taken the other drug before. It increases tolerance to central nervous system depressant drugs like anesthetics, benzodiazepines such as Valium and Librium. So the chronic alcoholic gets in a car wreck, goes to the hospital, needs surgery, but because their body has built tolerance to alcohol, it also has tolerance to the anesthetics, and the anesthesiologist finds it difficult to put that person to sleep for the surgery without giving an almost lethal dose of the anesthetic. If you're going for surgery, it's recommended you not drink alcohol for at least a month beforehand. It's important to understand dependence, although more and more we're looking at alcohol use problems as falling on a continuum, and so mild, moderate, and severe dependence being only the most severe type of problem. Physical dependence results in things like people going through the DTs. They have the shakes, they may have seizures. There's also a psychological dependence that after using alcohol as a way to alter mood or feelings, people find that they are more anxious, more angry, more upset when they don't have it, and therefore are driven back to drinking to regulate emotions. Detoxification may be either medically managed or social. If someone has ever had withdrawal symptoms that involve physical dependence, the DTs, the shakes, the seizures, seeing things, they should be sent to a hospital in order to be detoxed. Alcohol is one of the few drugs in which people die while the level in the bloodstream is falling. Most other drugs, people die as the level is rising. Once it peaks and starts to fall, they're off the hook. But alcohol, you can die in withdrawal. And so if there's any high levels of alcohol or any history of withdrawal problems, they should be sent to a medical facility. Social model is more the person sleeps it off, they drink water, juice, throw up or have diarrhea or whatever, and then gradually begin to eat normal food and move on. Withdrawal begins with all substances when the blood alcohol content or blood alcohol level falls, regardless of how high it is. Chronic alcoholics have the belief often that if they keep drinking and keep the level up so it doesn't fall, they don't have to go into withdrawals. And to some extent this is true right up until they pass out, and then the liver begins to remove enough alcohol that they may wake up having seizures or DTs. Some physiological effects of alcohol we should mention. It inhibits the antidiuretic hormone and increases urine output when the blood alcohol content is rising, but not when falling. So as long as you're drinking and the level's going up, you're going to run to the bathroom. Once it peaks and starts to fall, that antidiuretic hormone kicks in, and then people stop being able to urinate. Why? To prevent dehydration. It also reduces oxidation of body fat. It's a peripheral dilator. It makes the skin feel warm and turns red, but in fact, the idea that drinking alcohol can keep you warm in the snow has turned out to be a myth. When it dilates the peripheral blood vessels, you lose heat more rapidly, and in fact, drinking and taking your clothes off because you feel warm can lead to freezing to death. Alcohol increases gastric secretion and therefore makes many people have an increased appetite. It does increase stress hormones, and that's a problem if you are anxious or have anxiety disorders or are under stress. It does disrupt sleep. Many people believe that drinking helps them sleep, but in fact, drinking and passing out is not the same thing as sleeping. When you drink to try to fall asleep, once your level in the bloodstream drops a little bit, you'll wake up, and so you get less and less real quality sleep. It does suppress REM, dreaming sleep, and people who drink on a regular basis find that when they quit drinking, there's a rebound and they get a lot more dreams. It impairs memory, especially short term. If blood alcohol content rises rapidly, it can cause blackouts. And there can be grayouts, patches of memory that's missing in the middle of a day or an evening, which may be state dependent or may be the result of the blood alcohol content rising and falling rapidly. Hangovers are a common after effect of heavy drinking, and every New Year's Day there's a lot of hangover recipes, things to treat and prevent hangovers on the internet. Hangovers typically occur 4 to 12 hours after peak blood alcohol concentration. Symptoms include the headache, the dizziness, the nausea, vomiting, an increased heart rate, fatigue, and thirst. Hangovers are the result of dehydration, plus the blood-brain barrier leaking glucose. So the brain is dehydrated, you are thirsty, but you have almost no blood sugar in your brain and bloodstream. Hangovers affect the ability to drive even after the blood alcohol content reaches zero. So people with a hangover the next day are actually more impaired than they were when they were under the influence. Despite all the recipes for hangover cures, most of those are simply symptom modification. The only really effective cures are time. Give it enough time and eventually you sleep, you eat, you drink, and it goes away. And not getting drunk in the first place, which is actually the key to preventing hangovers. There are synergistic effects that are especially dangerous. Alcohol mixed with barbiturates may be fatal. Alcohol and marijuana also interact and increase motor impairment and reduce driving skills. Marijuana in the bloodstream results in doubling the impairment of alcohol. Sensorimotor effects. There is complex reaction time increases above 0.05 blood alcohol content. That's why many jurisdictions in Europe are now reducing their DUI level to that amount. Body sway is the basis of having people walk the line. When intoxicated, people swing back and forth. Again, in our jurisdiction in California, DUIs and wet reckless, wet reckless can be charged. You can be arrested for it at as low as 0.04 if you break some other law or drive dangerously. The impact on driving ability has resulted in major changes to the way we see alcohol use. It used to be considered basically a joke. The drunk ended up in the ditch. And when we largely drove cars that drove at slow speeds and there weren't many on the road, that may not have been a serious issue. But with today's highways and high speeds, it's a very serious issue. MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, ran a number of commercials showing people who had died and the problems that were caused by drunk drivers. This has resulted in stricter laws, more punishment. First DUI is now extremely expensive. I've heard numbers in the range of $10,000 and more, and it may result in jail time. And there is now zero tolerance for people under 21. Also, second and third repeat or multiple DUI offenders are getting even more serious penalties. Psychological effects of alcohol. Alcohol intoxication changes emotions and mood when in combination with other factors. Lower blood alcohol content often results in an elevated and friendly behavior or feelings when it's rising. But a high blood alcohol content results in anger and fatigue, especially when the level in the bloodstream is falling. Above 0.05, most people cannot estimate time, don't know how long they've been drinking or how far they've been driving. Low blood alcohol content disrupts the estimation of distance, attention, and concentration. More psychological effects of alcohol. Intoxication changes interpersonal behavior. It affects sex. It makes people often more interested in it, but it results in men being less able to perform it. It also may result in conflicts over inappropriate sexual advances. Alcohol also changes or affects aggression. It may increase violence towards another, increase the risk of committing violent crimes. There's some connection between spousal abuse and alcoholism. Not that drinking a beer makes someone violent, but people who are domestically violent often are heavy drinkers or users of drugs. We've seen problems with alcohol at sporting events where fans get out of control, and significant problems at fraternity, sorority, college parties in which large amounts of alcohol are consumed. Some thoughts about alcohol and sex. It often increases interest, but decreases performance, and the effects can depend on the blood alcohol content. And it has additional effects on reproduction. There are effects of chronic heavy drinking. Short-term effects are toxic throughout the body and damages the liver. Longer-term effects can include nutritional deficiencies, Wernicke's disease, and many other systems in the body are affected. The central nervous system, the cardiovascular system, endocrine system, immune system, gastrointestinal system. Alcohol consumption increases cancer of every cell alcohol touches on its way through the body. Alcohol and brain functioning. Alcohol can cause mild cognitive impairment or severe irreversible brain structure and functional damage, depending on the amount consumed in the time period over which it's consumed. It can also result in difficulty with abstracting, problem solving, memory, learning, and perceptual motor speed. Wernicke and Korsakoff are two separate syndromes that we see in people who are chronic alcohol users. They're often found together, though they can occur separately. Wernicke's is the result of poor nutrition, especially vitamin B. Chronic drinkers frequently don't have any interest in eating food as they fill up on the alcohol. Wernicke's includes confusion, loss of memory, a staggering gait, inability to focus the eye, but it is reversible when treated with a lot of vitamin B. Korsakoff's, however, is a more severe, less reversible condition. It is caused by damage from the alcohol, and it damages the brain structure. There's memory impairment. Short-term memory and learning are most affected. Confusion, confabulation, which is false memories that the person believes even though they never happened. And it seems to have more effect on recent and short-term memory and less effect on long-term memory. Alcohol in the liver. Most people are aware that there's a connection between drinking alcohol and cirrhosis of the liver, but the damage to the liver can go far beyond that. The liver is the major metabolic site for alcohol. The liver is highly damaged by the alcohol, and there are various ways the liver is damaged. The simplest is fatty liver, in which a layer of fat is deposited in the liver and gradually begins to clog it and reduce its ability to filter the blood and remove toxins. Once the liver is clogged with fat, it may develop a thing called alcoholic hepatitis, which is inflammation of the cells in the liver, damage to those cells, and jaundice, the yellowing of the skin and eyes. Beyond alcoholic hepatitis is cirrhosis of the liver, which is the most life-threatening. This develops in 10 to 20% of alcohol-dependent people. Only half of the people who develop cirrhosis, get that diagnosis, will live 5 years. People with cirrhosis often also have fatty liver and/or hepatitis. Lastly, heavy alcoholic consumption increases the risk that someone will develop liver cancer. Alcohol and reproduction. With men, there is reproductive damage. It reduces the male hormone levels, reduces the reflective response, reduces sperm production, may cause breasts to grow in men, and a loss of interest, a drop in performance, even impotence. Shrinkage of the gonads, hypergonadism, is possible, and defective sperm are also possible. With women, alcohol can cause dysfunction of the ovaries, cessation of menstrual period, other menstrual disorders, damage to the unborn, the fetus, and alcohol is a teratogen, meaning a monster causer. It causes significant birth defects. The fact that alcohol interferes with a woman's pregnancy is not a reason to consider alcohol a form of birth control. In studying alcohol and alcohol use disorders, it's important to understand fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. This consists of 3 conditions on a continuum, so there's no absolute cutoff from one to another, but most people are aware of fetal alcohol syndrome. This is the most severe and has some very specific characteristics. There is physical deformation of the unborn child, small eyes, small eye openings, drooping eyelids, underdeveloped mid-face, skin folds, underdeveloped depression in the upper lip. There's also can be small head circumference, abnormal creases in the palms, abnormal joints, cardiac defects, tumors, minor ear abnormalities. At 10 years, children who had fetal alcohol syndrome will have low, normal to severely retarded intellectual functioning. There can be additional physical problems, and the majority of children born with fetal alcohol syndrome will not be able to live independently at any point in their life. More on the fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Beyond fetal alcohol syndrome, we used to think that if women drank too heavily during pregnancy, it damaged the baby, but if the baby was born looking normal, then you got off okay. We now know that there are milder forms of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder that aren't as visible and noticeable as fetal alcohol syndrome. Fetal alcohol effects have few visible effects, but retardation or cognitive disabilities are likely to occur. With fetal alcohol spectrum disorder at the mild end, children have smaller exposure to alcohol, may still have specific learning disabilities. No safe level of alcohol use by pregnant women has been demonstrated. Any alcohol consumed during pregnancy is a risk to the unborn. And the effects of many other drugs or other drugs in combination with alcohol are unknown. Unfortunately, many women don't realize they're pregnant and are drinking at the very beginning of pregnancy. So if some female is engaging in sex without adequate birth control, they should not be consuming alcohol because there is a risk that they will conceive a child with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. An important question that comes up in alcohol and drug studies is alcoholism or drug addiction really a disease, or is drinking a choice? To understand this, we have to look at the distinction between acute and chronic diseases. It used to be that most of what medical doctors treated were acute. You got terribly sick, pneumonia, and you went to the hospital. You broke a leg, they put a cast in it. Today, 75% of the things that medical doctors treat are chronic illnesses. They include things like diabetes and high blood pressure. So it's important to know that alcohol use disorder, mild, moderate, and severe, is included in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual and has characteristics of a disease, though in the initial stages, people choose to drink. The point is, at some point, they've consumed enough that when they try to stop, it becomes a problem. To compare this to other medical diseases, is depression a disease? We certainly think so. Is type 2 diabetes a disease? I've heard it called a disease of excess calories, but in fact, I don't know anyone that has set out to develop type 2 diabetes. Some people with type 2 diabetes can undergo severe weight loss and their blood sugar moves back under control. But having once had it as a diagnosis, it usually stays on the file. There's always a risk that it will recur. It's important to look at some newer research, and one I found is in the role of delta FAS-B in the functioning of the brain. If you want a good video on this on YouTube, there's a video called The Great Porn Experiment. There's no pornography, it's brain scans, but brain scans of men who watch a lot of pornography. Recently, there's been an epidemic of impotence in men in their younger years, in 30s and 40s. We used to think it was only impotence, erectile dysfunction was confined to men at much advanced elderly age. Well, what we found is that these young men in the area of 30 and 40 developing erectile dysfunction had had access to pornography online their entire lives. Previous generations, you had to go to some store and the guy had it under the counter and you bought a magazine and there were maybe a few pictures or something. But now people were able to watch, men were able to watch sexual intercourse in all kinds of positions and with multiple partners and so on. Well, when they did the brain scans to study this, men who watch a lot of pornography and developed erectile dysfunction, certain parts of their brain light up. They become aroused only when they are seeing pornography. The result is they've been aroused so much by pornography, it becomes difficult for them to be aroused by a live female. Once you've watched orgies, it's hard for threesomes to be arousing. It's increased need for arousal. Having discovered this issue, they began to look at the effects of other drugs, and it appears that different parts of the brain and different delta FAS chemicals build up, and once they build up from the use of a particular drug, then a switch flips, and thereafter that becomes the default state. And without that drug, That's part of the brain does not function correctly. So we begin to see that it's quite possible gene expression for chemicals and behaviors over time to make fundamental changes in the brain which lead to addiction. Terminology is important, and learning the vocabulary in any profession helps you to do the job. These are some of the terms, but not all of them, that we've covered in this chapter, but you should be aware of these. Distillation, proof, standard definition of standard drink, blackout, confabulation, teratology, fetal alcohol syndrome, fetal alcohol effect, and fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and the central nervous system. What should you have learned from this video or the readings in Chapter 9? Well, the alcohol humans drink is called ethyl alcohol or ethanol. Alcohol is a depressant, a central nervous system depressant. Alcohol is produced by fermentation, and alcohol is made stronger by distillation. At this point, you should know how to convert proof to percentage or percentage to proof. As far as the history of alcohol, alcohol was first used during the Old Stone Age. The first use in the United States was by the Pilgrims. The first use in North America was by Aztecs in Mexico who drank pulque. And you should know why is alcohol a larger problem for senior citizens. More things you should have learned from this video in Chapter 9. What is a standard drink? What factors affect the blood alcohol level or blood alcohol content? What is the breakdown process for alcohol? What 4 liver diseases are caused by alcohol? And 3 categories of fetal alcohol problems.